In 1972, there was no bigger name on God's green earth than David Cassidy. He wasn't just a singer, he was a mania. He outsold Elvis and the Beatles combined in their prime. He was the Adonis with the velvet voice and the face that launched a billion-dollar empire. But look closer at the man in 2017. Look at the trembling hands. Look at the man falling off a stage in a strip mall club, unable to remember the lyrics to the song he had sung 10,000 times. A man dying of a secret he was too ashamed to tell the world. For years, we believed the lie. When he stumbled, he told us it was dementia. He said his mind was fading, just like his mother's. We gave him our sympathy. We mourned the golden boy, losing his memory. But in his final hours, on a cold hospital bed in Florida, the smoking gun finally emerged. David Cassidy wasn't losing his mind. He was losing a 40-year war with a bottle he couldn't put down. His final words, whispered to his daughter Katie as his organs finally surrendered, would become the most heartbreaking summary of a life ever recorded. Today, we go beyond the lunchboxes and the stadium screams. We reveal the specific scene where the teen idol myth was executed and the 3 words that will haunt his fans forever. This isn't just a story about a faded star. This is a story of industrial betrayal. It's a cautionary tale about how Hollywood takes a boy, turns him into a product, and leaves him with nothing but a debt to the taxman and a shattered liver. This is the price of perfection. This is the tragedy of a man who spent 40 years trying to kill Keith Partridge, only to realize the character was the only thing the world would ever let him be. Welcome to the reality behind the velvet. To understand the tragic end, we have to see how the product was manufactured. In 1970, David Cassidy was a shy, 20-year-old musician with a hunger for the blues and a love for Jimi Hendrix. He wanted to be a rock star. He wanted grit. He wanted soul. But a studio called Screen Gems, under the massive umbrella of Sony, had a different plan. They didn't want a musician. They wanted a mirage. They cast him as Keith Partridge. And in an instant, the boy disappeared, and the brand was born. Within months, David's face was on everything. And we mean everything. Lunchboxes, pillowcases, bubblegum wrappers, bedspreads, posters in every girl's bedroom from Ohio to Tokyo. The Cassidy mania was a global machine, a system designed to convert adolescent emotion into measurable corporate profit. At his peak, David was generating $500,000 a week in tour revenue. In today's money, that is over $3 million every 7 days. He was the most valuable piece of intellectual property on the planet. He was a walking bank. But here is the hidden antagonist, the systemic betrayal that would ensure his eventual financial collapse. Because David was a minor when he signed those first contracts, the adults in the room, the suits at Screen Gems, secured sweeping control over his entire existence. His name, his likeness, his very image. They sold hundreds of millions of dollars in merchandise. And David? David received almost zero in royalties. He was the face of a $500 million empire, while he was literally having to borrow money just to pay his own taxes. He became a blue-collar icon in a velvet suit. He was working 18-hour days on the TV set, then flying to stadiums on weekends to perform for 50,000 screaming fans, only to return to a life where he was effectively broke. He felt like a con artist. In 1972, he famously told Rolling Stone, "I feel like a highly paid flea. They own me. They suck my blood until I have nothing left to give." This was the velvet prison. He couldn't walk down a street without being ripped apart by fans. He couldn't play the music he loved because the studio demanded safe bubblegum pop. He was a man being eaten alive by his own success, and the pressure was already starting to find a vent. A vent that would eventually take the form of a bottle, and a genetic curse passed down from his father, Jack Cassidy. The golden boy was already starting to tarnish, but the world was too busy screaming to notice the cracks. But the prison bars were about to turn into something much darker. Coming up next, the night the music died in London, and the tragedy that would convince David Cassidy he was a monster. The 26th of May 1974. London was vibrating before the first note was even played. Dramatic pause. Outside White City Stadium, 35,000 teenagers pressed toward the gates, many clutching homemade signs with one name written again and again. To them, David Cassidy was not just a singer. He was a promise, a soft-haired escape from a world that felt too adult, too strict, and too loud. This was supposed to be the pinnacle of Cassidy mania. But inside the stadium, the noise swelled into something almost physical. As David took the stage, the crowd surged. Security lines bent. Barriers shook. And then, in the chaos, people began to fall. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but its consequences would last a lifetime. Teenagers were knocked off their feet, pinned under a mass of bodies heavier than panic itself. Screams were swallowed by the roar of the music. When the surge finally eased, the ground was littered with shoes, torn clothing, and terrified faces searching for friends who no longer answered. More than 800 people were injured that night. But one name would change David Cassidy's soul forever. Bernadette Whelan. Bernadette was only 14. She had come to see her idol. Instead, she was caught in the crush. She would spend 4 days in a coma before her heart finally gave up. Imagine being 24 years old. You are the most loved person on the planet, and you are told that a child is dead just because she wanted to hear you sing. Backstage, witnesses recalled Cassidy growing visibly shaken as the scale of the disaster became clear. This was not the triumph his career had promised. This was a reckoning. He retreated to his hotel room, pulled the curtains, and refused to come out. He would later describe feeling like a monster fed by hysteria. He felt like an indirect murderer. While the promoters were counting the ticket sales, David was counting the cost of his soul. Within weeks, he did the unthinkable. At the absolute peak of his fame, with millions of dollars on the table, he announced his retirement from large-scale touring. To the industry, it was career suicide. To the fans, it was a betrayal. But to David, as he later described, it was survival. The boyish illusion that fame was harmless had collapsed. And once innocence is gone, it never asks permission before taking your peace of mind with it. Behind the velvet suits and the golden boy smile, a quieter theft was taking place. It wasn't happening on a stage, but in David's blood. Every tragedy has a villain. For David Cassidy, the hidden antagonist was alcoholism. But for him, it wasn't just a choice, it was a genetic curse. David's father, Jack Cassidy, was a brilliant Tony Award-winning performer. But he was also a man haunted by mental illness and severe addiction. David grew up in the shadow of a man who was both his hero and his greatest fear. He spent 40 years trying to not be like Jack. But the cruelty of fate is that we often become the very thing we are running from. The escape did not arrive all at once. It slipped in quietly, disguised as relief. According to those close to him, David didn't drink to celebrate. He drank to soften the edges of a life that never slowed down enough for him to process it. He used the bottle to drown the ghost of Keith Partridge. He used it to numb the memory of Bernadette Whelan and the screaming crowds at White City. Alcohol became a companion that asked no questions. For decades, he lived a life of functional addiction. He would go on tour, he would hit the notes, he would smile for the cameras. But the moment the lights went out, he was alone with the hidden antagonist. By the early 2000s, the blood of the idol was turning into poison. The biology of the fall was relentless. Chronic alcohol consumption leads to steatotic liver disease and eventually cirrhosis. His body was literally shutting down from the inside out. But David was a professional. He was trained to hide the cracks. He spent years telling his family and his fans that he was fine. He was a man with a stage 4 secret, desperately trying to maintain a 1,970 seconds illusion. What the world didn't realize was that the golden boy was eroding. Toxins that his liver could no longer filter were beginning to enter his bloodstream, slowly migrating to his brain. It was a biological time bomb. Dramatic pause. And while he was fighting this internal war, he was also fighting a financial one. The half-billion-dollar empire he had built for others was about to leave him in the dark. Coming up next, the Financial Vanishing Act. How a man who sold $500 million in merchandise ended up losing his home to the bank. And the physical toll that turned the Adonis into a stranger. In the world of the cruel voice of fate, fame is often a mask for poverty. Dramatic pause. By the mid-1970 seconds, David Cassidy was a walking bank. As we've seen, his image sold over $500 million in merchandise. If you were a teenager in 1972, David Cassidy was in your house. He was on your bed sheets, your mirrors, and your television screen. He was the gold standard of the industry. At his peak, he was generating enough revenue to buy a small country. But David Cassidy performed a financial vanishing act that wasn't his fault. It was a theft by design. Because he had signed his life away as a minor, he was essentially a ghost in his own empire. While the executives at Screen Gems and Sony were swimming in pools of cash, David was struggling to keep his head above water. By the time he reached his 50 seconds, the golden boy was running out of gold. To the public, the numbers were shocking. To David, they were humiliating. In 2015, the music finally stopped. David Cassidy officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing revealed a devastating truth. He had roughly $2 million in assets, but he owed over $2.1 million to banks, lawyers, and the government. The man who had been the most bankable star in the world was now technically underwater. Where did the $500 million go? It didn't go to Ferraris or private jets. It went to the system. He spent decades and millions in legal battles, desperately trying to sue the studios to get a fair share of the merchandise he had already sold decades prior. He lost. He spent millions more on maintenance, the endless cycle of rehab facilities and medical bills as the hidden antagonist began to destroy his body. He was forced to sell his sanctuary, his beautiful estate in Florida, at a public auction for just $2 million. For our audience, you know the heartbreak of losing your home. You know the weight of realizing that your life's work has slipped through your fingers. David was a man who belonged to everyone, but in the end, he owned nothing. He was a legend living on a credit card, waiting for the cruel voice of fate to call in the final debt. To the world, he looked rich. To his accountants, he was a cautionary tale. Hollywood is a business built on the face. And for David Cassidy, his face was his curse. He was the golden boy, the Adonis with the velvet look. He redefined what it meant to be handsome for an entire generation. But the physical toll of 40 years of the bottle was about to turn the Adonis into a stranger. By 2010, the changes were no longer just aging. They were biological evidence of a body in crisis. Because of the end-stage liver failure, his body was failing to filter the toxins from his blood. His face became bloated, a clinical condition often referred to as moon face. His skin took on a tint of jaundice, a sickening yellow hue that told the truth his words were still trying to hide. As his liver scarred over, toxins were entering his brain. This is a condition called hepatic encephalopathy. It causes a loss of balance. It causes confusion. It causes a man to forget his own lyrics. To the world, he looked like a man losing his mind to dementia. And for a long time, that was the story he told. He used the dementia label as a shield, a way to explain his falls on stage without admitting to his addiction. Look at the footage from those final shows. The way he stumbles. The way he slurs. This wasn't just a faded star. This was a man dissolving in front of our eyes. He had lost the velvet. He had lost the glow. He was a shrunken version of himself, his stomach distended from the fluid buildup of late-stage cirrhosis. He was a man dying in the light of the flashbulbs. The physical toll was the final execution of the teen idol myth. The body was finally keeping the score that the mind tried to ignore. The golden boy was tarnished beyond repair, and the stage, the only place he ever felt loved, was about to become the scene of his final humiliation. Coming up next, the Agoura Hills fall that forced the secret into the open. The moment the lie about dementia crumbled, and the 3 words he whispered on his deathbed that changed everything we thought we knew about his wasted time. February 2017. A small stage in Agoura Hills, California. Dramatic pause. This was the specific scene of the final collapse. David Cassidy was 66 years old. He wasn't playing stadiums anymore. He was playing clubs where the smell of stale beer was stronger than the applause. He began to slur his words. He forgot the lyrics to "I Think I Love You," a song he could once sing in his sleep. And then, in front of a room full of cell phone cameras, he fell. He didn't just trip. He tumbled off the stage, a broken man in the glare of the lights. The next day, he made a shocking announcement. He told the world he was retiring because he was suffering from dementia. He said it was the same disease that had taken his mother. The public was heartbroken. We felt a collective wave of sympathy for the golden boy who was losing his mind. But the cruel voice of fate knows the truth. It was a lie. It was one last mask. David wasn't losing his memory. He was losing his war with the bottle. He had used the dementia story to hide the fact that he had been drunk on stage. He was so terrified of being seen as an addict that he chose to be seen as brain damaged. Why was he so afraid? We have to look back to 1972. David had tried to perform an image suicide by posing nude for Rolling Stone magazine. He wanted to kill the Keith Partridge character so he could be a serious actor. But it backfired. The serious world rejected him. The teen world was scandalized. He learned a bitter lesson that day. If you destroy the illusion, you destroy the career. So in 2017, he chose a tragic lie over a messy truth. He was a man drowning in plain sight, still trying to protect a golden boy who had been dead for 40 years. The stage had finally stopped protecting him. All it could do now was record his fall. To understand the soul of David Cassidy, you have to listen to the words he said when he thought the cameras were off. His life was a trail of forgotten quotes, cries for help that we mistook for lyrics. In 1972, at the height of the madness, he told Rolling Stone, "I feel like a highly paid flea. They own me. They suck my blood until I have nothing left to give." He knew, even then, he knew he was being harvested. He knew his identity was being sold by the pound. Then came the smoking gun confession of 2017. Recorded for a documentary just months before he died, he finally dropped the mask. He said, "I lied about the dementia. I just simply, I drank. And I drank until my liver couldn't take it anymore." Can you imagine the weight of that? To spend your final months pretending your brain was failing because you were too ashamed to admit your heart was broken. But it's the final quote. The one whispered in a Florida hospital room on the 21st of November, 2017, that acts as the moral of his entire life. His daughter, Katie Cassidy, was by his bed. He looked at her with the last of his strength. He didn't talk about the records. He didn't talk about the money he lost. He whispered 3 words. So much wasted time. That is the physical toll of fame. It's not just the wrinkles or the liver failure. It's the realization that you spent 40 years being a product instead of a person. He was a man who had everything the world desired. But he died realizing he had missed the only thing that mattered. He was the golden boy who found out too late. That gold is just a cold, heavy weight that keeps you from swimming back to the surface. He wasn't a victim of lack of talent. He was a victim of a system that rewards intensity but offers no guidance when the light fades. Coming up next, the aftermath of a legend in the shadows. How a man loved by millions could feel so utterly alone, and the universe bridge to the next icon who lost everything to a single choice in a surgical suite. When the lights finally went out on the 21st of November, 2017, the world didn't just lose a singer. Dramatic pause. We lost a piece of our collective youth. For the generation that grew up in the 70 seconds, the death of David Cassidy was the death of the Partridge Promise. It was the end of the belief that life would always be sun-drenched, that the colorful bus would always keep rolling, and that we would always be as young as Keith Partridge. But David's aftermath is more than just an obituary. It is a study in the total exhaustion, the Keatsuk of a human soul. He died in a hospital in Fort Lauderdale, surrounded by his family. But the tragedy is that he had been alone for decades. He had spent his final years in a mansion he was forced to sell, living in a town where people only knew him as the former star who struggled with the law and the bottle. He left behind a complicated legacy, a daughter he struggled to connect with, a fortune that had been siphoned away by a predatory system, and millions of fans who were left wondering, how could someone, loved by so many, feel so utterly discarded? The answer lies in the cruelty of the idol. Hollywood does not love the man. It loves the moment. And once the moment passes, the man is left to pay for the image with his life. David Cassidy didn't just waste time. He was robbed of it by a business that didn't know how to let its heroes grow old safely. He was a child turned into a product, a man trapped between expectation and identity, and an individual who never learned how to exist outside the spotlight that shaped him. So, what is the final verdict on the man who thought he loved us? Dramatic pause. He was a boy who wanted to be Hendrix, but was forced to be a doll. He was a man who earned $500 million for others and died with a debt he couldn't pay. He was the golden boy who found out that the spotlight is a fire, and if you stay in it too long, you simply turn to ash. To our audience, the generation that still hears his voice when you close your eyes, his story is a mirror. It reminds us that wasted time is the only thing we can never buy back. David Cassidy gave us his youth, his beauty, and eventually his health, just so we could have a 70-second soundtrack. May he find the peace that he only found in his final 3 words. The velvet prison is finally empty. The golden boy is finally free. David Cassidy lost his life to a bottle. He lost his fortune to a contract, but for others, the cruelty of time is even more specific. In the same years that David was fading, another icon was rising. A woman who became the sweetheart of the biggest movie of the decade. A woman with a face every girl in America wanted, and a dance move every boy in America memorized. But unlike David, her fall wasn't a choice made at a bar. It was a choice made in a surgical suite. She was at the very top of the mountain. She had the world at her feet. But she listened to a cruel voice that told her she wasn't quite perfect enough. She walked into a 20-minute procedure, and she walked out as a stranger. In 20 minutes, she committed image suicide. She became so unrecognizable that even her own friends didn't know who she was. She killed her career with a single knife and spent the next 30 years wondering where the star went. Dramatic pause. You think you know the price of a nose job? You think you know what happens when the babe of the summer becomes a nobody by the fall? Click the video on your screen right now to uncover the devastating fate of the girl who had it all and threw it away for a new face. The cruel voice of fate is ready to show you the dance that never ended. The file is open. Are you ready to see the stranger in the mirror?